11 minutes. That's how long it took the Special Air Service to end the Iranian embassy siege at Prince's Gate, London, on the evening of the 5th of May, 1980. 11 minutes from the detonation of the first frame charge against the second-floor window to the last terrorist falling on the staircase. 5 gunmen dead, 1 captured. 19 hostages walked out alive. The entire operation broadcast live to a watching nation that had never before seen its own special forces in action. Inside a small flat in West London, a 33-year-old former Soviet intelligence officer sat in front of a borrowed television and watched the assault unfold. He had been in Britain for less than 2 years. He still spoke English with a heavy accent. He had spent the previous 15 years of his life inside the Soviet military system, the last 8 of those inside Soviet military intelligence. He had been trained in a doctrine that considered the Spetsnaz of the GRU the most dangerous special forces unit on Earth. When the smoke began pouring from the embassy's upper floors, he turned to the British intelligence handler sitting beside him and said 7 words that he would repeat in classified debriefings, in lectures at British staff colleges, and finally in the pages of the book that introduced the West to the inner workings of the Soviet Special Operations machine. They don't fight like soldiers at all. That wasn't admiration. It wasn't dismissal either. It was the bewildered recognition of a professional who had spent his entire career inside a system that was supposed to be the gold standard, and who was now watching another system do something his own had never been built to do, and could never do, no matter how many men it threw at the problem. His name was Vladimir Bogdanovich Rezun. The world would come to know him by the pen name his publisher gave him 3 years later, Viktor Suvorov. He was, as confirmed by the former head of the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet General Staff in a 1992 interview with Krasnaya Zvezda, a captain of the GRU who had served undercover at the Soviet mission to the United Nations in Geneva. He had defected to the United Kingdom on the 10th of June, 1978, vanishing from his Geneva apartment with his wife Tatiana and their 2 children, smuggled across the Swiss border by British intelligence in a span of hours so tight that the GRU station chief was still searching the apartment for him when the family touched down in England. He had been sentenced to death in absentia by a Soviet military tribunal. He would never see his homeland again. He would spend the next 4 decades in Bristol, in southwest England, teaching tactics and military history at a British military academy, writing books that would sell more than 1 million copies, and trying to explain to anyone who would listen the single observation that had shattered his understanding of his own profession. The Russians had built a force called Spetsnaz. The British had built a force called the Special Air Service. From the outside, in the brochures and the doctrinal manuals and the parade ground demonstrations, they looked like cousins. Both were small elite formations. Both were trained to operate behind enemy lines. Both produced soldiers who could parachute, navigate, kill at distance, and survive in environments that would destroy ordinary men. Both, on paper, were variations on the same idea. In practice, they were not. They were not even the same kind of organism. To understand what Suvorov saw and could not unsee, you have to start where he started, in the world that produced him. He was born on the 20th of April, 1947, in the village of Barabash in Primorsky Krai, in the far east of the Soviet Union, the son of a Ukrainian artillery major who had fought through the Second World War and survived. The family settled eventually in Cherkasy in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and at the age of 11, the boy was placed in a Suvorov military school, the system that produced the next generation of Red Army officers from boyhood. He moved between 2 of these schools, in Voronezh and Kalinin, before progressing to the Frunze Kiev Higher Military Command School, from which he graduated in 1968. He was 19 years old when he was admitted to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was 21 when he rolled into Czechoslovakia in August of 1968 as a tank platoon commander in the 145th Motorized Rifle Regiment of the Carpathian Military District, part of the Warsaw Pact force that crushed the Prague Spring and ended that brief experiment in Czechoslovakian liberalization under the treads of T-55 tanks. In his first published memoir, The Liberators, he would describe the cold mornings, the supply shortages, and the specific moment he understood that the women and children watching his column pass were not greeting him as a savior. They were watching an occupier. He was good at his job. By 1970, at the age of 23, he was an intelligence officer in the headquarters of the Volga Military District in the city of Kuibyshev. He served briefly with the 808th Independent Army Reconnaissance Company, a Spetsnaz unit, where he experienced firsthand the training regimen that the GRU used to manufacture its specialists in deep reconnaissance and sabotage. From 1971 to 1974, he attended the Military Diplomatic Academy in Moscow, an institution known inside the system as the Conservatory, the school that produced the GRU's foreign intelligence officers, the men who would operate under diplomatic cover in foreign capitals. He graduated. He was assigned to Geneva. He spent 4 years working out of the permanent mission of the USSR to the European Office of the United Nations, ostensibly a diplomat, actually a military intelligence officer running agents and collecting on Western military and scientific developments. By the time he received the rank of major, as he later confirmed, and as the head of the GRU later confirmed, he was a fully formed product of the system. He had been told repeatedly by instructors who had themselves been told the same thing, that the Soviet military was the finest fighting machine on earth, that the Spetsnaz were the spearhead of that machine, and that any Western Special Forces unit, including the British SAS, was a derivative imitation of Soviet methods that had been developed first and developed better in the Soviet Union. There was a slogan that circulated inside the GRU in those years. The British had a regiment. The Soviets had a system. It was meant as a boast. Suvorov would eventually come to understand that it was a confession. The Spetsnaz that Suvorov had been raised to believe in was a force of overwhelming scale, according to the figures he would later publish in his 1987 book, Spetsnaz. The story behind the Soviet SAS by the time of his defection in 1978. There were 20 GRU Spetsnaz brigades active across the Soviet Union and its European deployments, supported by 41 separate companies. Each brigade fielded between 1,000 and 1,500 men. Even by conservative estimates, the GRU alone could deploy more than 30,000 Spetsnaz personnel at full mobilization, a figure that did not include the airborne units, the naval Spetsnaz of the Soviet fleets, or the KGB's own special groups, including Alpha Group, established in 1974, and Wimpel, which would be founded in 1981. By comparison, the British 22 Special Air Service Regiment, the operational regular regiment of the SAS, fielded 4 Sabre squadrons of approximately 60 operators each. The total operational strength of the regiment, even with its supporting headquarters, signals, and training elements, did not exceed 500 badged personnel at any given moment in the late 1970s. The Soviet Spetsnaz outnumbered the British SAS by a ratio that, depending on which units one counted, ran from 60 to 1 to well over 100 to 1. The training was, in many physical respects, more brutal. Spetsnaz recruits at units like the 91st Special Forces Company at Spassk-Dalny and at the training divisions that fed the brigades with sergeants every 6 months were subjected to a regimen that Suvorov would describe in detail. Hand-to-hand combat against death row prisoners recruited specifically for their viciousness. Psychological conditioning that drove some recruits to suicide and others to murder their officers. Pain tolerance drills involving barbed wire and improvised weapons. Forced marches in winter conditions that approached the limits of what the human body could survive. The unofficial motto of the system was that a Spetsnaz soldier should be more frightening to his enemies than the enemy was to him, and the methods used to produce that quality were, as Suvorov put it, designed to multiply the brutality of normal Soviet army training many times over. The weapons were good: the Kalashnikov family of rifles, the suppressed pistols, the silent ballistic knives, the small entrenching tools that Spetsnaz operators were trained to throw with axe-like precision at distances of up to 25 meters. The doctrine was thorough. Spetsnaz were tasked, in the event of war, with infiltrating NATO territory days before the outbreak of hostilities, locating and destroying tactical nuclear weapons, assassinating senior military and political leaders, sabotaging command and communications nodes, and creating the strategic chaos that would allow the Red Army's tank divisions to roll west across the German plain unopposed. It was, by every measure that Soviet doctrine was equipped to apply, a formidable force. And yet in Geneva, working inside the GRU's legal residency in a city full of Western diplomats and Western technology, Suvorov began to notice things that did not fit the picture he had been given. He had access, as a junior officer at the embassy, to a steady stream of open-source Western military publications. He read Jane's Defense Weekly. He read the British Army Review. He read accounts of Operation Storm, the long-running counterinsurgency campaign in Oman from 1970 to 1976, in which a small SAS contingent operating alongside locally recruited irregulars, the Furkats, had defeated a Soviet and Chinese-backed insurgency that had threatened the Strait of Hormuz. He read about the SAS deployment to Mogadishu in October 1977, when two SAS advisors, Major Alistair Morrison and Sergeant Barry Davies, had embedded with the West German GSG-9 unit and helped end the hijacking of Lufthansa Flight 181 with a stun grenade technique that they themselves had pioneered. He read about Northern Ireland, about the SAS's covert reconnaissance operations in South Armagh, about the patient and unglamorous work of building agent networks inside the provisional IRA. The pattern that emerged from those readings did not match what he had been taught. The SAS was not a copy of anything. It was something else. The system Suvorov had been raised in produced men who were dangerous, but the men were not the system's primary product. The system's primary product was the operation. Spetsnaz operators were interchangeable parts inside an industrial machine designed to deliver specific effects at specific times in specific places. They were trained to execute pre-planned missions with mechanical precision. They were not, in any meaningful sense, trained to think. The system the SAS came out of was inverted. The man was the primary product. The operation was a downstream effect of having the right man in the right place. SAS selection, the brutal cycle of marches across the Brecon beacons in South Wales, the jungle phase in Brunei, the resistance to interrogation training, the months of continuation that followed, was not designed to produce soldiers who could perform a fixed set of tasks. It was designed to produce a specific type of human being, an individual capable of operating alone, in any environment, against any enemy, with minimal support, and crucially, capable of making his own decisions when the plan disintegrated and there was no one left to give him orders. That was the thing the Soviet system did not produce, because the Soviet system did not trust the individual to produce it. A Spetsnaz operator who improvised was suspicious. An SAS operator who did not improvise was a failure. Suvorov saw this difference more and more clearly through the second half of the 1970s. He was not yet ready to act on it. He had a wife and 2 small children. He had a career trajectory inside the GRU that, if he survived the political infighting, would deliver him into the senior ranks of Soviet military intelligence by his early 40s. He had spent his entire adult life inside the system. The system had given him everything he had, but the system had also begun to crack. The disillusionment that he would later describe in his semi-autobiographical book Aquarium, published in 1985, was not a single event but an accumulation of pressures. The forced betrayal of a friend, an episode he would describe in detail and which several reviewers have noted may have been altered for narrative effect. The reading of forbidden Western works, including, by his own account, George Orwell. The growing realization that the Soviet Union depended for its survival on Western technology and Western trade, and that the propaganda about Soviet superiority was, at the level of practical detail, a fabrication that the men running the country no longer believed themselves. And then, in the early summer of 1978, something specific went wrong inside the Geneva Residency. The exact nature of the failure has never been publicly confirmed. Suvorov has said that the station chief decided to use him as the scapegoat for an operational disaster that was not his fault. He understood that if he returned to Moscow, he would face, at best, the end of his career and, at worst, a Soviet prison cell. He made his choice. He approached the British. The first contact, according to his own account and to subsequent reporting, was through the British consulate in Geneva. The negotiation took days. The British wanted intelligence. He wanted his family out. The terms were agreed. On the 10th of June, 1978, Vladimir Rezun, his wife Tatiana Korj, herself a GRU officer, and their two young children, his son Alexander and his daughter Oksana, walked out of their Geneva apartment in the morning and never returned. By the evening, they were in the United Kingdom. The Soviet ambassador in Bern lodged a furious protest. The KGB and the GRU launched a frantic search. The British said nothing for 18 days. On the 28th of June, 1978, English newspapers reported, briefly and with no detail, that a Soviet intelligence officer named Rezun had taken refuge in Britain with his family. He was given a new identity. He was placed under protective security. He began the long process of debriefing, conducted by officers of the Secret Intelligence Service and the Defense Intelligence Staff, in which he laid out, over months, everything he knew about the structure, personnel, doctrine, training, and operational planning of the GRU and the Spetsnaz brigades it controlled. It was during this debriefing process that Suvorov first encountered, at close range, the world he had spent the previous 15 years preparing to fight against. He was driven, on more than one occasion, to the regimental headquarters of the SAS at Bradbury Lines in Hereford. He was given controlled access to specific aspects of the regiment's training methodology, partly because his debriefers needed to understand which elements of the British system the GRU already knew about, and which it did not, and partly, as he later acknowledged, because his hosts were curious to see his reaction. His reaction, recorded in declassified portions of his debriefings and described later in his books, was not what they had expected. He had assumed going in that he would find a smaller, less well-resourced version of the Spetsnaz. The British budget for special operations in 1978 was a tiny fraction of what the GRU spent on its brigades. The British had no equivalent of the vast Spetsnaz training divisions, no equivalent of the Ryazan Higher Airborne Command School with its dedicated GRU training program. The British Operational Regiment, 22 SAS, fitted into a single set of barracks on the western edge of a quiet English town. What he found was a different category of organization entirely. The selection course, the cycle that ran twice a year and reduced an initial intake of around 200 candidates to a final passing group of typically 20 to 30, was not by Spetsnaz standards more brutal in its physical demands. The Brecon beacons in South Wales, the mountain range where SAS endurance is tested, peak at only 886 meters. The Russian training grounds were larger, colder, and harder. The Soviet endurance tests were longer and more punishing. By raw physical metrics, the Spetsnaz training regimen, particularly in the training divisions Suvorov had observed in the Volga military district, was tougher. What was different was what the course was testing for. The British were not looking for the strongest candidate or the fastest one. They were looking for the candidate who, alone on a mountain at 3 a.m. in driving sleet with a 30-kilogram pack on his back and a folded map in his pocket, could keep walking when his body was telling him to stop, and his mind had agreed. They were looking for the man who, when he reached a checkpoint and was told only the grid reference of the next checkpoint with no information about the time limit, the route, or whether the directing staff would even know if he failed to arrive, would set off without complaint and find his way there using nothing but his own skills and his own judgment. The Spetsnaz training divisions Suvorov had passed through did not test for this quality. They could not test for it because the doctrine they trained for did not require it. A Spetsnaz operator was always part of a group. He was given an objective, a route, a timeline, and a rendezvous. He executed those orders. If something went wrong, he reported back through the chain of command and waited for new orders. The notion of a 4-man team operating for 14 days in the mountains of Oman with no external support, building relationships with local tribesmen, making operational decisions on the basis of information gathered from the ground, and only reporting back to higher headquarters when there was something specific to report. This was a concept that had no analog in the Soviet system. Suvorov began to understand, slowly, that the SAS was not a smaller version of the Spetsnaz. It was a different species of organism. The Spetsnaz was a hammer. The SAS was a scalpel. And the men who held the scalpel had been selected and trained for years to wield it. The killing of doubts in his mind was completed by the Iranian embassy siege in May of 1980. 6 gunmen of the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan, an Iranian Arab separatist group recruited and trained according to a 2014 academic study of the Iran-Iraq War by the Iraqi government, stormed the Iranian embassy at 16 Princes Gate in South Kensington at approximately 11:30 in the morning on the 30th of April, 1980. They took 26 hostages, including the embassy staff, several visitors, and a Metropolitan Police officer named Trevor Locke, who had been guarding the entrance. They were armed with pistols, submachine guns, and hand grenades, predominantly Soviet-made weapons, which intelligence reports later concluded had been smuggled into the United Kingdom in the diplomatic bag of the Iraqi embassy. For 6 days the siege continued. The hostage-takers demanded the release of 91 Arab prisoners held by the Iranian government in Khuzestan and safe passage out of the United Kingdom. The British government refused to negotiate on either point. Police negotiators, working under the supervision of Deputy Assistant Commissioner John Dello of the Metropolitan Police and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rose, the commanding officer of 22 SAS, secured the release of 5 hostages in exchange for minor concessions. The SAS, alerted in the first hours of the siege, moved B Squadron's standby counter-revolutionary warfare team down from Hereford to a holding location in Regent's Park Barracks and began the painstaking process of building an intelligence picture of the embassy's interior. That picture was assembled with methods that, in retrospect, demonstrated everything that was different about the British approach. SAS soldiers crept onto the roof of the embassy at night to identify potential entry points. The building's caretaker was interviewed in detail, providing the critical information that the first 2 floors were fitted with armored glass that would not yield to sledgehammers and would require frame charges instead. MI5 lowered microphones down the embassy's chimneys to monitor the gunmen's conversations. British gas began noisy excavation works in an adjoining street to mask the sound of preparation. Aircraft taking off and landing at Heathrow were directed to fly lower over Prince's Gate to provide additional sound cover. On the 6th day of the siege, the lead hostage-taker, an Iranian Arab who used the codename Salim, ordered the execution of the embassy's press attaché, Abbas Lavasani. The body was thrown out of the front door at approximately 7 in the evening. 23 minutes later, on the explicit authorization of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the SAS launched Operation Nimrod. What Suvorov watched on television that evening, what every adult in Britain watched that evening, because the BBC and ITN had positioned cameras at the rear of the embassy and the assault took place in full daylight under live broadcast, was a demonstration of British Special Forces methodology that had no precedent in any Soviet doctrinal manual. Red Team abseiled from the roof down the rear of the building. Blue Team approached through the library at ground level. A diversionary explosive charge was detonated above a skylight to disorient the gunman. Frame charges blew the armored windows on the second floor. Stun grenades flooded the rooms with concussive blast and blinding light. Soldiers in respirators and black coveralls, armed with Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns and Browning high-power pistols, entered the building through the smoke and the broken glass. 11 minutes, 5 gunmen dead, 1 captured, 1 hostage killed by the gunman during the assault, 2 hostages wounded, 19 hostages saved. The number of SAS soldiers who took direct part in the assault was somewhere between 30 and 35. What Suvorov saw was a scale he could not reconcile with what he had been taught. The Soviet response to a hostage situation of comparable scale, demonstrated in subsequent decades at Budyonovsk in 1995, at the Dubrovka Theater in Moscow in 2002, and at the Beslan School in 2004, would involve hundreds of personnel from multiple agencies, would be conducted with overwhelming force, and would result on every occasion in the deaths of large numbers of hostages alongside the terrorists. At the Dubrovka Theater, FSB Special Forces from Alpha and Vimpel ended the siege by pumping an aerosolized chemical agent into the building before storming it. At least 130 hostages died, the majority from the effects of the gas. At Beslan, the assault on the school resulted in the deaths of more than 300 people, including 186 children. The British had freed 19 hostages out of 20 in 11 minutes with 35 men. Suvorov began to write. His first 3 books, The Liberators in 1981, Inside the Soviet Army in 1982, and Inside Soviet Military Intelligence in 1984, established him as the most articulate and detailed Soviet defector of his generation. They were published initially in English, written in Russian, and translated by his editors at Hamish Hamilton in London. He was, at the time, the only living defector from the GRU operational ranks who was both willing and able to describe the inner workings of the main intelligence directorate in granular detail. In 1985, he published Aquarium, the semi-autobiographical account of his recruitment, his training, his work in Geneva, and his defection. The title was the nickname GRU, officers used for their headquarters in Moscow, a building whose interior they compared to a tank full of piranhas. The book sold widely. It established Suvorov, the pen name his publishers had given him in 1981, choosing a Russian 3-syllable surname that evoked the great Tsarist Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov as a fixture of Cold War literature. In 1987, with Hamish Hamilton, he published the book that would define his contribution to the Western understanding of Soviet Special Forces. Spetsnaz, The Story Behind the Soviet SAS. The title itself was the argument. The Soviet system claimed that the Spetsnaz were the original and the SAS the imitator. Suvorov, with the experience of 9 years inside both worlds, argued the opposite. The SAS was the original. The Soviets had built a much larger, much more brutal, much more numerous force, but the force they had built was not the same kind of thing. The book sold widely in the West. It was translated into multiple languages. According to defense analysts, it contributed directly to the establishment of specialized counter-Spetsnaz units in NATO countries, including the Norwegian Heimevernes HV-016 unit, which was raised specifically to neutralize the deep penetration teams Suvorov had described in the chapters on Spetsnaz wartime missions. His testimony, combined with intelligence from other sources, reshaped Western planning assumptions about how a Soviet conventional offensive would unfold. Inside the Soviet Union, the book triggered a different reaction. The GRU, which had until then operated under the comfortable assumption that the existence of its Spetsnaz brigades was a closely held secret, found itself facing a Western audience that now possessed a detailed map of its order of battle. The unit numbers, the training establishments, the operational doctrine, the recruitment criteria, all of it was now in the open. The death sentence handed down in absentia against Vladimir Rezun was reaffirmed. The head of the GRU, Colonel General Yevgeny Timokhin, would confirm in his 1992 interview with Krasnaya Zvezda that Rezun had been a captain at the time of his defection and that the sentence remained in force. Suvorov continued to write. By his own count and the count of his agents, he produced 16 books over the following 4 decades, translated into 27 languages, with combined sales exceeding the threshold at which his publisher stopped counting. He moved from London to Bristol in southwest England, where he settled with his family. He gave lectures at British military academies, including, by his own account, regular sessions in which he taught Soviet tactical doctrine to British officers preparing to face it on the European battlefield that, until 1989, everyone assumed would be the place where the Cold War would be decided. He was not always right. The GlobalSecurity.org assessment of his work, written by professional intelligence analysts who reviewed his published material against subsequently declassified Soviet archives, noted that his books contain a measurable proportion of fiction, open-source material presented as insider knowledge, and propositions that have since been disproved. He was a defector with an axe to grind, a memoirist with a publisher's deadline, and a man rebuilding his life in a new country on the basis of his perceived value to that country's intelligence services. There were incentives in all of those positions to overstate, to dramatize, and to present his observations in the most striking possible terms. But on the central question, the question he had begun asking himself during his last years in Geneva, and the question he answered in detail in the 1987 book, his judgment has been broadly vindicated. The Spetsnaz was not the Soviet SAS. The Spetsnaz was a Soviet answer to a Soviet question, designed to deliver specific battlefield effects in support of a doctrine of mass conventional warfare, and the men who served in it were trained to a standard that, in raw physical terms, exceeded what the SAS demanded of its candidates. But the SAS was answering a different question, and it was answering that question with a different kind of soldier. The British system produced individuals. The Soviet system produced units. When the questions facing both forces in the late 20th and early 21st centuries shifted away from mass conventional warfare and towards the kind of small-team, intelligence-led, operationally creative work that had become the default mode of post-Cold War conflict, the British system found itself with a force that had been training for that mode for decades. The Soviet successor states found themselves with a force that had been training for a war that no longer existed. The proof played out across the battlefields of the post-Soviet world. In the First Chechen War, in the Second Chechen War, in the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, in the eastern Ukraine fighting from 2014 onwards, in Syria, and finally in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began in February of 2022, Russian Spetsnaz units fought under their own names and their own banners, and again observers noted the same pattern. Brave men, often well-equipped men, sometimes effective men, but men whose battlefield decisions were constrained by a chain of command that did not trust them to make decisions, and whose operational effectiveness was limited by the structural assumption that the individual was the property of the unit, not the other way around. The British, meanwhile, ran their small teams through Northern Ireland, through the Falklands in 1982, through the Gulf War in 1991, through the Balkans, through Sierra Leone, through Afghanistan, and through the meat grinder of Iraq from 2003 onwards, and the men who came back from each of those campaigns wrote down what they had learned and fed it into the next selection cycle. The institutional memory deepened. The training refined itself. The product, the individual SAS operator, at the moment he badged into the regiment, became a more capable, more adaptable, more independently dangerous human being with each generation. Suvorov, watching from his home in Bristol, recorded all of it. He gave interviews. He wrote columns for Ukrainian publications, supporting the Ukrainian side in the war that began in his country of birth. He stated openly that he considers himself, his wife, and his children to be Ukrainians, despite his Russian language and his Soviet upbringing. He stated equally openly that he had never returned to any country of the former Soviet Union and never would, because the Russian conviction in absentia was, to his understanding, still in force, and because the Russian state had demonstrated, in the cases of other defectors, that it remained willing to act on such convictions decades after they were issued. In December of 2018, he gave an interview to The Guardian. He was 71 years old. He had been in Britain for 40 years. The interviewer asked him, near the end of the conversation, whether he believed the people he had left behind in 1978 would ever forgive him. "Will they forgive me?" he said. "No." He said it with the same flat precision that he brought to every other subject. It was a fact. He had betrayed the system that had built him, and the system had not forgiven him and would not forgive him, and the death sentence remained in force, and he would die in Bristol or wherever he settled next, and the men he had once served alongside would die in Russia. And the difference between his life and theirs was that he had walked out of the system, and they had not. The phrase that the title of this account is built around, the 7 words he used to describe what he saw on his television screen in May of 1980, recurs throughout his writing in different forms. It appears in Spetsnaz, the story behind the Soviet SAS, in passages where he is trying to explain to a Western audience why the Soviet system, despite its enormous size and its punishing training regimen, could not produce what the SAS produced. It appears in his lectures at British military academies in versions that his former students have repeated in their own writing. It appears in interviews he gave throughout the 1990s and 2000s, when journalists asked him again and again what the central insight of his career had been. They don't fight like soldiers at all. He meant several things by it. He meant that the SAS operator did not move like a conventional soldier, did not communicate like a conventional soldier, did not conduct himself in a fight like a conventional soldier. He meant that the relationship between the individual and the unit was fundamentally different. He meant that the SAS man on the ground was, in a way that no Spetsnaz operator could be, the author of his own operation, and that this single structural fact was the difference that no amount of training, no amount of equipment, and no amount of doctrinal imitation could close. He had spent the years from 1968 to 1978 inside a system that had taught him to despise this kind of soldier. The system had told him that the SAS was an aristocratic indulgence, a regimental flavor of the British class system, an outdated relic of the colonial era preserved out of sentiment by an empire that no longer existed. The system had taught him that the future belonged to mass-produced, doctrinally uniform, centrally controlled special forces operating in concert with the conventional army. The system had been wrong on every count. He spent the years from 1978 onwards trying to explain that to anyone who would listen. The Russians did eventually acknowledge, quietly and partially, that he had been right. In 2013, after years of debate inside the Russian General Staff, the Kremlin established a new branch of the Russian Armed Forces called the Special Operations Forces Command, or KSSO. The new command was modeled, according to multiple defense analyses and according to the public statements of the Russian defense establishment itself, on the British SAS. The model was small unit operations. The model was professional volunteer soldiers rather than conscripts. The model was independent decision-making at the team level. The model, in other words, was everything that Suvorov had described as missing from the Soviet system 3.5 decades earlier. It was, in its way, a vindication. A man who had been sentenced to death for telling the truth about the system he had served had lived long enough to see that system, in its successor form, formally acknowledged that the truth he had told was correct. He was 85 at the time of the 2025 anniversary of his defection. He was still in Bristol. He had outlived Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev, and Yeltsin. He was watching from southwest England as the Russian Federation he had once served and then fled fought a war in his country of birth, using a special forces apparatus that had finally, fitfully, partially, recognized the principles he had been arguing for since 1981. 11 minutes at Prince's Gate, 6 days of siege, ended by 35 men in 11 minutes, with 1 civilian fatality and 19 lives saved. A captain of the GRU sat in a borrowed flat in West London with a borrowed television and watched the smoke rise from the embassy and understood in those 11 minutes that everything he had been taught about the Soviet system's superiority was a lie that the men telling it had stopped believing themselves. He turned to his handler. He said the 7 words, "They don't fight like soldiers at all." He spent the rest of his life trying to explain why. The books he wrote, the lectures he gave, the interviews he sat for, all of them returned to that single observation. The British had not built a bigger version of the Spetsnaz. They had built a different thing. They had built over a period of 40 years, from the formation of the Special Air Service Brigade in the North African desert in 1941 through the post-war reconstitution of 22 SAS in Malaya in 1952 and the long campaigns in Borneo, Aden, Oman, Northern Ireland, and beyond, a system that produced a specific kind of human being. A man who could think, decide, and act on his own initiative in any environment, against any enemy, with minimal support, and who could be trusted by the regiment that had badged him to make the right call when there was no one left to make it for him. That was the difference. That was the gap that no Soviet doctrine could close, no Soviet budget could buy, and no Soviet selection course, no matter how brutal, could replicate. Vladimir Bogdanovich Rezun, captain of the GRU, defector, writer, exile, and witness, spent 47 years trying to explain it. The system he had left 3.5 decades after his book on the subject was first published, finally began to listen. He had been right all along.